So thank you all for being here, this amazingly wonderful and generous audience. I thought I would title this I Love You Man because Paul Zuger always said if Gib ever wrote a book, it would be called I Love You Man, because that's what the guy's life was about. So I'm not going to talk really about the art today. I want to talk about the guy, because the question that comes in my mind, so Gib was a man on a mission, right? He was driven all of his life to create art and to give it to people. That's all he ever wanted to do. He told his little brother Jerry that when they were very young. He said, you know, I'm going to make a name for myself, I'm going to make art, and I'm going to give it to people. Jerry said, well, how about making money, man? You know, that helps. Gib didn't care. So that was what he was about. He was about making art, and it was about changing the world through his art. And this is what he said about it. I hope when somebody looks at my art, they see something in themselves that's holy. That's what he was putting in the art. That's what it's about. I'm not here to entertain you, but to touch your heart and to open it. In fact, we called the new book Opening the Heart, because that was his mission. So the thing that always puzzled me about Gib Singleton, brilliant guy, highly educated, great artist, where did that come from? Because Gib was a sharecropper kid in the Boot Heel of Missouri, right? They lived in a company house. They bought their stuff at the company store. At the end of the year, if there was any profit, they made some money. His mom and dad are illiterate. This is the world they lived in. Now, I just snagged these pictures. We don't have any pictures that I know of Gib's early life. But this is the world that he lived in, okay? So where does a kid, by the age of 3 or 4, when his brothers and sisters are talking about him drawing bowed crosses in the dirt with sticks and making little sculptures out of straw and mud, where does this come from? How can that be? Because this is the kid, right? There's no art in his world. He doesn't have a Rembrandt poster hanging on the wall. He's out riding a mule named Red while his dad's working the one-man plow, and he's hand sowing winter wheat. He's hoeing in the melon patch. We don't know where it came from. No one knows. His brothers and sisters talk about it. They said he always knew this, he always said this, but we don't know why. We don't know where it came from. What he did do, by the way, the mule, Red, was one of his best friends when he was a little kid. He would sit on that mule. They would put him on the mule. His dad would lift him up, put him on the mule. They would go cut a furrow, come back. He would slide off the mule, pick up the galvanized jug wrapped in burlap that was kept moist, have a drink of water. His dad put him back on the mule, and off they'd go again. And after a couple furrows, the mule knew what to do. And so Gib said, I would sit up there and I would dream. And I would dream about going out into the world, and I would dream about doing art. As a little kid, because the farm got foreclosed when he was 4 or 5. So somewhere this is happening. We don't know where. Later on, he'd put it in his art, right? So that's based on his dad Herschel with the one-man walking plow out there on the farm in the Boot Heel of Missouri. Migrant worker, he knew migrant workers. This elongation that we think of with him, where did that come from? Because living that life thins you out. That's where that came from. He knew those guys. End of the day, now it's a westernized version, but Gib said, you know, in the old days, the best thing you could say about a man is he was a good hand. He could ride, he could rope, he could shoot, he could be a farrier, he could doctor the animals, whatever it was. And that's where Gib got this. In fact, his dad, he said, could do anything. He knew how to plant, he knew how to harvest, he knew how to make things, how to build things, how to fix things. He did whatever was necessary to keep the farm going and to keep his family going, because it was a hard life. 6 kids survived. The oldest, Berlin, takes off one day with the family car, which is a Model A Ford, and disappears. He goes to St. Louis. And he doesn't come back. And they're like, uh-oh. So Herschel takes off to St. Louis to find out where Berlin is and where's my car. And he gets up there and he finds Berlin's in Granite City, Illinois, rather, and he's working in Granite City Steel. He's got a job. And Granite City Steel is hiring. So the farm's foreclosed. We don't know where they're living. Maybe in a tent, maybe out of the car before. We don't know. All Gib would ever say about it was, we scuffled around some then. And Jerry said there were nights without food. So they go to Granite City because the mill's hiring. Mom and Dad both get jobs in Granite City Steel. And for these guys, this is like a dream come true. They've got a school, they've got a community. All of a sudden, everything becomes possible for them. And one of the things that becomes possible is Gib is now exposed to a wider variety of materials, and he starts doing art. Pencil on paper sack, which is all he can afford. Now he's actually doing drawings, pencil on a paper sack. So think about this kid, who, by the way, was his mom and dad basically said he was uncontrollable. You couldn't make him do anything. He did what he was going to do, and Jerry said once he got it in his mind, that was it. You couldn't stop him. You could beat him. His mom used to beat him up with a broomstick, and made no difference. He kept right on going. So about 9, he enters one of those pencil drawings on a paper sack at the state fair, and he wins a blue ribbon. Gib's mind is, I'm an artist. I can do this thing. In his dad's mind, now, this is a bad thing that's happened because now this kid has this illusion that he can go out and do art. And Herschel's saying, you can't do art. Are you nuts? You'll never have a pension. You'll never be able to retire. You can't do art. You can't stop the kid. He's doing art. He gets into high school. This is his first oil painting. He gets into high school, and he meets a guy named Gene Acey, who is the art teacher at Granite City High School. Gib said, I don't know what they were doing with an art teacher, right? I mean, they're teaching welding so you can work in the mill. That's the primary thing of high school there, is to get the kids ready to work in the steel mills. But Gene Acey realizes this kid loves art. And Gib said, and I realized for the first time there are other people in the world who love art too. I didn't know that. I thought I was the only one. And here's this guy. So this guy introduces him to acrylics. Then he introduces him to oils. This is Gib's first oil painting. He did it as a present for his mom. Notice the hobo with the glove on the stick. And very indistinct, terrible photo, but you can see, look at the technique, look at the precision for a guy starting out with oil. That's unheard of. Look at the detail in here, right? This kid's got an eye. He's already got proportion, right? And there's something in him. So Gene Acey then does something else that totally transformed Gib's life. He loaned him a book, and in the book is Donatello's David. And Gib said, I have to do bronze. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Well, 16-year-old kid, I have to do bronze. You can't do bronze. Well, as Jerry said, when he decided to do something, he was going to do it. And what he did was enlisting Jerry, who was a year younger and was always his companion in crime, right? They decided to build a foundry. They have no money. They're going to build a bronze foundry. So they go out and find a 55-gallon drum, heavy wall, and what it had contained was nitrocellulose, which is an explosive. So they wash it out and wash it out and wash it out, and Gib takes a cutting torch and he cuts it in half. And afterward, Jerry throws a match into one of the halves and it goes whoop, and they're like, oh, we're not sure why we're alive. That thing should have gone off, and if it had, it would have taken down a building as well as us. But they went to Granite City Steel and they, what's a nice way to say, they appropriated fire brick, and they lined this thing with fire brick. They sealed it all up with castable refractory. They made a lid. They put a nipple for a gas line into it, and then they needed a blower. Couldn't find a blower. Gib found an Electrolux vacuum cleaner in a scrap pile, rebuilt it, reversed it, and that was the blower. He called it Thor. That was his first foundry. So 16-year-old kid, I have to learn how to pour bronze, and he does. He can't afford a pyrometer, anything like that, so he learns to tell by temperature, for the temperature by the color of the bronze. That's the only way that he can figure out how to do it. So that's an example of Gib. Whatever he set his mind to, he just went out and did it. One day he said, you know, if I'm going to be a real sculptor, I'm going to have to also do marble and granite. Well, you can't afford marble and granite, except they go to an old cemetery in East St. Louis and they find a tombstone that's all mossed over and looks like the guy was buried in 1857, so they figured nobody'd care. And they lever it up into the car and take it home, and he carves it into this. Never touched stone before. Okay? Look at the workmanship. Look also at the big hands. So big hands have always been a characteristic of Gib, right? He had it right there. He's maybe 17 years old at this point. The ability to work that stone and to do this is basically, he called it the embryo. And basically it's Shakespeare's 7 ages of man, going from infant to adult to old man returning to infancy. Jerry still has that piece, by the way. So here's this kid in high school, right? And he's now producing bronze. He is now producing granite sculptures. He's still painting. And by the way, they decided for a while they were going to be musicians. And they were busking on the street corner and so on. And they didn't make the cut when they applied to the amateur hour. And Jerry was devastated because they figured he's going to have to work in the mill. And Gib said, I'll go back and sell art. Because after he won that prize, he was starting to sell portraits to friends and neighbors for a nickel a pop. Pencil on paper sack. So he was making his own money. He was plowing it back into art supplies, buying watercolors and so on. So he was always a working artist from about age 9. So he gets out of high school, goes to, imagine this, SIUE, Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and he gets an AA in auto mechanics, right? Because he's still listening to his dad who says, you're going to have to get a job, kid. You can't be an artist. He marries Lynn Schumann, who's his high school sweetheart, right? And this causes a huge to-do because her dad is Fred P. Schumann, who is the big dog in Illinois politics in the Democratic world. She was supposed to marry Adlai Stevenson's son. Gib said, I think I kind of ruined that one. So he was head of the draft board as well. And Gib said, I'm sure he got me drafted because I was going to make a man out of me to be with his little girl. So we get to the hotel in Niagara Falls on our honeymoon, and there's a telegram, and it begins, greetings. Gib goes to the Army. He goes to Killeen, Texas, to Fort Hood, where he's a tank platoon commander for the 2nd Armored Division. Kids are born there, Shelley and Sherry. That's why he always loved Austin, because that was the nearest big town. And he gets out of the Army, comes back to Granite City, Illinois, got 2 kids, got to do something, right? Be a mechanic? Not really. But he's trying to support his family while Lynn's going back to school to get her credential. He's welding on live gas pipelines for Illinois Light and Power, where they literally drill a hole, put a balloon in the pipe, blow it up, and then you weld on this thing. And sometimes you blow yourself up in the process. He decided that was too dangerous, so he got a job working high steel on a bridge over the Mississippi. He said, you know, I'm part Cherokee, right? And Indians aren't afraid of heights, so I figured I wasn't afraid of heights either. And one day he's up there on the beam, hundreds of feet above the Mississippi River, with a hangover, walking on a 12-inch beam with a box full of rivets for the iron workers, and his hat blows off. And he watches his hat go all the way down and land in the river, and he said, and I froze. They had to send the crane up to pull me off, put me back on the ground. I said, that's it. I'm going back to school. I'm going to take my GI Bill, $130 a month, and I'm going to go get my art degree. And he went back to school to SIUE, and he got his bachelor's in art education. There, Gib Singleton at graduation. Well, in those days, you couldn't do anything with an art degree, right? So the first thing he thought was, well, I'll go down to Gardner Advertising, which is the in-house for Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, because they do lots of art for cartons and cans and so on. And they really liked him, and the guy said, let me show you where you're going to be working. And they take him in, and it's this windowless little cubicle. And the guy tells him how proud he is that the guy who designed the Michelob bottle worked in this cubicle night and day for 3 months. Gib said, thanks, dude, see ya. And he left. He went down to Alton High School, and he got a job teaching art. Except art there also included shop and mechanical drawing, because they were prepping kids to work in the steel mills. Fred P. rears his head again with that powerful connection in the Democratic Party, and he gets Gib a Fulbright to go study in Italy for a year. And he ends up at the Accademia di Belle Arti in Florence. And Gib said, it completely changed my life. He said, I realized in Italy that you either got to get good or you got to go home. He said, so he's living on the Via de' Benci down by Santa Croce. He's walking across Florence, the heart of Florence, every day to the Accademia, which is up in the northwest. And he's passing Cellini's and Amanati's and, you know, going past Brunelleschi's dome every day. And he's like, okay, this is what it takes to play at this level. I can do that. Well, he ends up coming back home. Oh, one other important thing that he finds, when you're at the Accademia, you not only have the David, you have the prisoners, sometimes known as the slaves. Michelangelo's, quote, unfinished. Gib said they were finished. This is the first abstract sculpture in the world. Had a huge impact on him, because at the Accademia they were teaching him to put in every hair and freckle, and the lines had to be perfect, and on and on. And he said, no. There's more feeling in those quote unquote unfinished pieces than any of that finished stuff. And that was where he really began to say, I'm going to be an abstract sculptor, because Michelangelo was an abstract sculptor, even though we don't think of him that way. So he goes back to Granite City after his year, and his job is awaiting him, and he says, no, I'm not going to do that. He said, how can I teach art if I don't know I can do it? I'm going to go out in the world, become a working artist. And he opens the East Bank Gallery. Built it out himself, carved the banisters and so on, lived upstairs, had a foundry out back named Hercules made out of recycled pizza ovens, and he and brother Jerry would pour in. And Gib said, I don't know what I was doing, right? Nobody in Granite City, it's a steel town. Nobody wants art, they want food. Well, he couldn't quite make it, but they hung on for a little bit longer because he always did his drawings. And Shelley, his older daughter, called them the clothesline drawings, because every weekend he and Mom would go out and hang them on the clothesline, and they'd sell them for $2 or $3 a piece. And sometimes they'd make enough money to keep the gallery going for another week. Otherwise, they were living off her teaching salary. So that was young Gib Singleton. And one day he did an opening, and this guy shows up and he says, you know, it's from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, he's the art critic. He said, I love your stuff, and let me tell you the truth. You can't do it here. Granite City is a steel town. It will not support the art you inherently do. You got to go someplace else. That was the first reality check that Gib had. By the way, at this time, he's doing anything he can. He's making, you know, he's welding with steel, he's working with ceramics, he's doing wood. He found a piece of driftwood on the Mississippi and he carved the Madonna, which later was molded up and turned into bronze, an amazing piece. And totally un-Gib Singleton, except very Henry Moore, right? So there he is in that abstract sculpture world. Well, they tell him he knows he's got to go away, and he doesn't know where, and he doesn't know how. I mean, he's a small town kid. He's got a family, 2 little girls. He starts going to Chicago on the weekends, and he's auditing classes at the Chicago Art Institute. And then he's coming back and running the gallery during the week. And then he's spending more time in Chicago, and then he's back, and then he's more time in Chicago. And Shelley said one day he didn't come back. He met a woman who said, I will make your career, I can help you do this. And all his life, Gib wanted that, and he kept meeting people, and it didn't work. Here's where Gib ended up. Sleeping on the beach at the Monument, Campo Beach in Westport, Connecticut, because he was trying to sell his stuff on the street corner in New York City, couldn't do it, said, I hated the city, I had to get out. He went to the beach. He said, I got a swimming suit, a couple jackets, some watercolors. That's basically all I got. I'm dead broke. So he's lying on the beach in front of the monument where he sleeps, where he lives, and this woman's walking one day and she stumbles over him. And this was Grace. She said, what are you doing on my beach? And he said, well, I'm a sculptor and I'm broke. And she said, are you any good? He said, well, I'm probably one of the best. And she said, come home with me. Home was a huge mansion on Long Island Sound, and the woman was Yvonne Goldsmith, who was the widow of Hank Goldsmith, who was the huge publisher of what was called pulp in those days. He did magazines and mystery novels, and made a lot of money doing it. He died. She had this huge mansion filled with, Gib said today, billions of dollars worth of art. He said, I took over her 3rd floor. I had a Monet in my room. I had Corot. There was a Diego Rivera hanging outside my room. And he would draw her. By the way, Gib's art history is amazing. You know, he was a true art historian. This is Van Gogh bedroom with Grace. Palace special, notice the Palace. Gib was into flying RC airplanes. This was a 7-foot wingspan with a $2,500 radial engine, which he bought when they were dead broke. As he said, I think that was the beginning of my second divorce. And another thing that's really interesting, so he had a line of called Say Grace cards, of greeting cards for a while, and also failed with that. See the cat? The cat is looking at you, Gib said, to see how you like the painting. That was the artist's insecurity coming through. He was never sure. He knew what he was doing and he had to do it, but he always said, especially with his bronze, he said, you never know, man, people are going to chop it up and turn it into wood screws. And he was always afraid of that because he always felt he had to explain it. So Gib's doing spiritual art, right? You can't do spiritual art in America, but when he was in Europe, he realized this is what I need to do. He'd been doing it, but he fell more fully into it. And he's doing it as watercolors, as studies. Look at the work here. And you've seen some of Leonardo's early drawings. Now this is obviously a much more abstract version, but look at the same flow and the same line in there. I mean, this guy could draw. He'd get fascinated by subjects. He got fascinated by Adam and Eve. Why? Because it was a turning point, right? After that moment, everything was different. So he did all these different versions of Adam and Eve, from extremely abstract to quasi-realism. He did Eve a lot by herself too, but he said, you know what it really needed was I needed Adam there because she needs somebody to receive what she's got in her hand. Somebody's got to receive the apple. His art history shows up again, combination of Gustave Doré and Rodin's Thinker, right? That's what he was inspired by when he did that. Very abstract, Picasso-like, his first mother and child really, Star of Bethlehem. And then Alexis is born. Gib loved Alexis. She was the light of his life. And he knew, I can't continue to starve when I've got a daughter. So he went down to Fairfield University and got a job running the sculpture department. And he taught at this Jesuit university. They were living in Ridgefield, Connecticut for that. And he found out one day that Frederick Remington had lived these last years in Ridgefield and then died there. And he got inspired by Remington, so he went up to New York to the Remington Museum. He saw all this Western stuff, and classic Gib said, I'm going to go out west to Santa Fe and do cowboy art. Well, that sounds like a reasonable thing, except he'd never been to Santa Fe, and he didn't even know where it was. But Deb's sister had been there once, Deb, his second wife now, and so we'll go to Santa Fe, because I heard you can sell your art on the street. So they come to Santa Fe, and Gib takes off on Western art. Stuff like his Pony Express, Blackjack Ketchum. He loved bad guys, not just good guys, by the way. Of course, his Texas Ranger, his Santa Fe Trail. Really great stuff. And again, he would go on a series. So he decided he was in love with rodeo. And he did a whole series on rodeo, asking Paul Zuger and his brother, how does the rodeo actually work? Because they'd ridden it. Gib had no idea. He did movies as an extra down at the Eves Movie Ranch, but he didn't understand all of the accoutrement, the gear, the riding, and so on. So he went down to Paul and his brother and said, teach me about it. And that's what he produced. The other thing that's happening in Santa Fe is there's an amazing native art movement going on. So we have Earl Bisses hanging all around the walls here, right? So Earl Biss is one of his buddies, R.C. Gorman is one of his buddies, Alan Hauser, Fritz Scholder, T.C. Cannon, all of these guys. And Gib rediscovers his native heritage. And he starts doing these wonderful pieces, the Eagle Dancer, the Cornpipe, right? Often involved with Native American spirituality. He really loved that. And of course, his Cherokee thing. So life is pretty good now. He's sort of making money sometimes. Deb's got a bakery. Alexis is growing up. She's in a private school. He's got a dog named Rain Cloud, which he calls RC. He calls him Rain Cloud because he's an Old English sheepdog and his hair is always in his eyes. So when you see his self-portrait, that's Rain Cloud with him. And of course, his great story about Rain Cloud is that he would take him into the palace where all the artists hung out because they'd let him run a tab until they sold something and paid for their drinks. And R.C. Gorman would be sitting on the next stool and he would say, sit R.C., stay R.C., down R.C., roll over R.C. That was their little joke. And then the bottom fell out. And Alexis died of an overdose of black tar heroin. She was 25. She'd been troubled for quite a while. And Gib never knew whether it was suicide or whether it was murder or whether it was an accident. And that not knowing was in a lot of ways as hard for him as losing her. So he didn't know what to do. Gib always said, when all else fails, go to work and put the failure in your work. And so he locked himself in his studio and he did the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Both, I think, in response to the trauma and because Alexis loved that story. She understood that story and she always asked him to do one of those and he never got around to it. I think we talked about that when we were filming earlier, that a lot of people argue that an artist will have a masterwork, and a lot of Singleton fans will argue that is his masterwork. So Gib was pushed further into spiritual work at that point by losing Alexis, and at the same time his health is failing. He's got COPD. Anybody who's spent any time in a foundry has COPD from breathing the superheated metal fumes, and smoking, of course, for most of his life as well. And one day, they put him in hospice. And they have him on morphine, they have him on oxygen, and at some point it's so bad, he's got about 5% lung capacity, they say you got 6 days to live. And his friend Father Julio comes down from Chimayo, the Santuario, to say goodbye, and ends up telling him, you're not going to die. God is going to give you more time because you still have work to do. And Gib concludes the work that he has to do is the Stations of the Cross because he's dreamed of them all of his life, and he's never been able to do them. So he ends up calling Shelley, his daughter, saying, come and get me out of here, take me to the Mayo Clinic. They go to the Mayo Clinic, and the docs rework his meds, do some treatments, and they say, you might last another 5 years if you take care of yourself. Gib goes back, and he goes to work on the Stations of the Cross, because that's what that work is he thinks he has left to do. And really interesting thing, he was trying to do, it's 14 stations is the official number. Gib said, well, maybe I can do 7. And Paul Zuger and his friend Wayne Yates said, try for all 14, let's see what happens. Well, every time he finished a piece, he got stronger. This guy's with 5% lung capacity, and he's running on will and faith. He finishes the Stations of the Cross, and at that point, he realizes this spiritual art is what I need to do. So losing his daughter, being told his life was over, is what finally pushed him pretty much full time into doing spiritual art. And he starts just cranking stuff. Some amazing stuff in a style no one's ever seen before. Look at the tribute to the dogwood, right? Where you literally see the soul rising. I mean, nothing like it in the world. The Job, the elongation again, the Baptist. This is an amazing body of work. His own Requiem. Now, periodically, he'll have a moment and he'll say, I still do Western art. Aces and Eights, brought out in 2010, sold down to proofs within a couple of years. Just an amazing piece. And then, near the end, he did his redemption. Near the end, Gib was thinking a lot about redemption. He was thinking a lot about Dante's ninth circle of hell, which is where people who betrayed a trust are kept. And he wondered, had he betrayed a trust by pursuing his art so single-mindedly? I mean, he walked out on his little girls. His second marriage came apart. He was evicted so many times. He was bankrupt. He'd not been a good friend sometimes. He knew he'd not been a good father. And he didn't know. He said, you know, what is it about that? Did I betray him? And so redemption was much on his mind. The last piece he did was a Lincoln. And it's very significant. One, because it was a childhood hero from his Illinois days. Two, because if you look at the shape of Lincoln, the way that he's standing, what he's doing is standing in a field, Gibbs said, with his head bowed, carrying the weight of 700,000 deaths in the Civil War. All he has to offer for it is the 13th Amendment. That's his atonement. And for Gib, it was the same thing. He wondered, you know, was I not there for the people that I love? How do I atone for that? And he ultimately decided the only way he could atone was with his art. That's why he did it. His daughter said this, I love that he understood what it was to be a man in search of his God to help him through this life. And that was his goal, was to figure that out and hand it back before he left. His own thoughts on it, he said, I always loved this. Gib always said, you know, we won't know for 500 years if I was any good. I might be the worst sculptor in the world, but I see people laying flowers at the feet of my bronzes and praying, and there's got to be something to that. It's an amazing feeling to know that your work has maybe helped somebody find a pathway to God. This is what happens when his work is out, as those of you who've seen it know. Tell you one final story because it's so perfect for Gib. On the day that he died, he was brought home from the hospital. 25 liters of oxygen, dosed on morphine, seemingly comatose. Paul Zuger rushed down to say goodbye. Walked into the room, Gib sat up, hugged him, said, I love you, man, I'll see you on the other side. Laid back down. That was the life and the death of Gib Singleton. Thank you.